So, how about those Christmas carols? Gini winced inside at how overbright she sounded. Her smile was strained. She felt it, saw her mom study her. Had she realized that Gini wasn't Van? She'd had trouble telling them apart for as long as Gini could recollect, but she eventually figured it out because they weren't alike, not inside. For a second, the longing swept over her to be small enough for the "it will be better in the morning" hug, or the "mom will take care of it" reassurance. She wanted to tell her about the big chill and what she'd learned about Dex, and that she was sorry she didn't come home that summer after Dad died. And yes, she was also sorry for all the times she didn't have a clue. Especially sorry for the things she still didn't have a clue about, and when she finally did, it would probably be too late. And for all the things that could never ever be again. 13. It all seemed like it started then, when puberty forced them into taking their first tentative steps toward becoming adults. It was the way it was, the way it had always been. Everyone grew up. Was that why she'd been knocked back to 13, so she'd learn what she clearly missed then? Little green ghosts of all her mistakes past, present, and future? She was supposed to learn what? That she hadn't understood her mom any more than her mom understood her at times? Did they think she never had regrets? Felt sorry for the things she'd gotten wrong? Desi flexed fingers that had been bent and twisted for so long, turning them so the palms were up, then running one hand down the back of the other. It wasn't Jeannie's imagination. Her mom was getting, not bigger exactly because she'd been shrinking for years, but older again. She could still move her hands, but the skin was losing its youthful look, lines beginning to spider along the backs. One reached out and smoothed a green hand down her hair as gray threads sprouted like weeds in the red. Dex made a sound. His eyes widened, and he looked at his hands, too. As she watched, it seemed they got longer. It was seriously creepy to watch. She felt a ball of heat in her middle. It wasn't awful. In fact, it felt kind of good, but also a bit like wetting her pants. It spread out into her extremities, the sensation indescribably odd, as her fingers seemed to stretch toward the light. Felt a bit like one of those camera views where the space seemed to shrink some around a character. She occupied a different amount of space in the room, relief mixed with worry. Would she forget? What was the point of having lessons you hadn't figured out yet if you couldn't remember them? How could she finally figure them out and learn to be better? Will I forget? Gini looked at Dr. Five. Felt like all this was his doing based on the slim evidence of his attempts at first contact with them. Do you wish to? Did she? This wasn't just about a bat crap crazy life lesson. She'd also have to remember the aliens. Could she handle the responsibility of knowing, of being one of the crazies with an alien abduction story? Not that she planned to out herself as one, but she'd know inside, and she wouldn't mind forgetting her mom had a thing for an alien. But if she took the out, if she opted to forget, then she'd forget Dex's confessions. She'd never know her mom had a Deasy side. She'd lose what she learned about them, about herself. Not that she was totally thrilled with her performance, but she hadn't wet her pants. That was something. Even if she never said a peep about all this, she could go to the conventions and know. That might be kind of cool. Painful because she'd have to resist the temptation to argue about how it really is, but still cool. It was almost as insider as having met the real Santa. Heat formed in her middle again, surging out. Felt a bit like the Grinch's heart growing, though she hadn't reached 2 sizes from 13. At least she didn't think she had. And technically she couldn't know how a Grinch felt, but still. She met Dr. Five's gaze with one that she hoped was filled with conviction and, well, not panic or anything else they needed to worry about. Did she believe she'd get the final say if she did choose to remember? If she wanted to, she needed to make her case, she realized. There was no alien crushing on her like Desi had had. I guess I'm like my mother before me. She played the mom card without much shame, then might have felt a little when her gaze connected with Desi's. I don't want to forget. Dex cleared his throat. I don't want to forget either. He smiled at her, and she had to smile back. She sighed. Part of remembering, part of learning from that remembering was taking responsibility for the choices made. Yeah, Dex had walked away, but she had let him. They hadn't dated during the covered wagon era. She could have called him. She'd been afraid. She hadn't trusted him or herself. So her dad had been at least partly right. They'd both needed to grow up. Yeah, she wished she'd done it a little faster. Embarrassing it had taken her 17 years, and getting knocked back to 13, to look him in the face and ask the question. Daphne sat up with a jerk, almost knocking Gini off her perch on the edge of the oversized couch. Apparently, she'd been playing possum, or been in a state of denial. Well, I want to forget all of it. I want to not be here, and I don't want to be here ever again. And if thought my dad would believe us, I'd so tell on all of you. If you forget, then you won't be mad at Dad anymore, Isaac pointed out. Daphne looked torn at this realization. 13-year-olds could be very vindictive. It's Christmas, Jeannie said, trying to ignore a little voice in her head saying that 13-year-olds weren't the only vindictive ones. Maybe you don't need to be mad at him. Interesting that she looked at Dex as she said this. Daphne stood up, her arms akimbo and her mouth open to reject this craziness. But Desi spoke first. Christmas is for giving, not getting, for giving, for remembering the good things. Desi climbed up on the bench and opened one of the songbooks. Nobody's perfect. Daphne appeared ready to dispute this as well, so Desi added with an adult firmness still at contrast with her appearance. Nobody, not even you. Her hands settled on the keys, trying out a few notes. As if this were their cue, the little green aliens left the captives and formed a circle around Desi. Gini had a weird feeling they'd done this before. Dex and Isaac cautiously lowered their arms and then got up. Desi looked at them over her shoulder, the authoritative mom tone to her voice when she said, "Well, get over here. It's time to sing." With some unease, the humans joined the alien circle while Desi played an intro. Not a bad job, either. A few wrong notes never hurt a Christmas carol. It was Desi's favorite, something else Gini had almost forgotten. It came upon the midnight clear. Alien voices, slightly off-key in an alien way, joined with slightly off-key human voices, but somehow, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the somewhat inexpert playing, it worked. Even Daphne's face softened some as the words called to her heart instead of her head. It was a pity that the short green Santa Claus rushed into the room with his beard hanging off one green ear. Santa! Desi's fingers hit the keys in a discordant chord. Look, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Instead of a ho, 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 he gasped out something that sounded very alien. It ignited a round of alarmed gasps from the alien portion of choir. Desi's eyes widened and she grew older some more. What? Jeannie asked. The men in black, Desi said. Gini wasn't sure what bothered her more, that her mom spoke alien or finding out the men in black were headed their way. You must speak to them, explain, one said, quivering with fright, his platter gaze fixed on Gini. They will listen to you. To me? Gini put her hand on her chest, but then dropped it as a bit over the top, even if she felt a bit over the top. Can't you just beam out? Dex asked, his body making another age adjustment. His shoulders broadened some. His arms stuck out now from the sleeve of the shirt that had fit him a few minutes earlier. He'd fit in his uniform soon. That may or may not help. Who knew what the men in black would respect? Jeannie looked at her arms and realized they were starting to extend beyond the edges of her sleeves, too. Probably not the time for a hallelujah, but she wasn't eager to be a lab rat for the men in black. Not that this was all about her, but still. Our mother ship sustained unknown damage. Its shielding cloak partially failed. We have not been able to contact it for many hours. Ginny looked at Dex. The NASA emergency? But what had brought the men in black their way? Other than the flying saucer up on the rooftop, had they somehow spotted that through the blizzard? Dex grew some more and his back seemed to straighten. What do you say, Gin? We could at least try to help them? She was kind of more interested in helping herself. Apparently, 13 still lingered in her bloodstream, but Desi and the aliens looked so imploring, and honestly, she and Dex and Van had played this save the aliens scenario when they were kids, which made it a no-brainer. Maybe it had been programmed into her DNA, though hopefully not during some kind of weird alien abduction moment. She nodded, helpfully she hoped, and not as unwilling as she felt. Dex looked at the kids, one brow lifted. Isaac nodded without even thinking about it, which kind of surprised her. Daphne hesitated, but she was at that follow-the-crowd age and finally nodded too. There was a gleam in her eyes, though, that showed there was still a little bit of kid left in there. Apparently Gini had some too, because unwilling began to melt in the excitement of possibly outsmarting the men in black. How long have we got? Gini asked. For the first time she realized the wind had died down. Great, now it decided to quit storming. Possibly an hour, possibly less, Dr. Five said, after consulting the pad he'd used to confuse them earlier. Maybe precision was challenging when one was used to counting in plus or minus light years. How functional is your mothership? Isaac asked, pulling out his notebook and pencil. It functions well, one said, but we need our mothership to alter to go home. Oh, please, don't let me forget, Gini said involuntarily. I promise I won't tell. Okay, that sounded very 13 still. Dex's lips quivered. We should both change, quickly. Gini looked down. He was right. Her legs stuck out the bottom of the pants far enough to look odd. Isaac didn't look up from his writing. I'll work on a plan while you change. He paused, and now he looked up. But hurry. She and Dex exchanged possibly their 1000th look of something. Did Isaac create plans to feel in control? She couldn't say he'd succeeded or failed at any of them. She could give him chops for having flair. Gini found it a bit unsettling that a couple of aliens attached themselves to she and Dex. At least they gave her the one she thought was a girl. Four's feather had lost its sass, as if it too feared the men in black. Gini made a pass through the bathroom. She did not want to pee her pants in front of the feds. Then she changed, stopping with some dismay when the arms of her favorite sweater hung down over her hands. I'm not completely me, yet. Four blinked without comment, so Gini went out in the hall and found Dex rolling up the sleeves of his uniform shirt. I know, he said. Can't be helped. They started down the stairs and had just reached the bottom when there was a knock at the front door. Four gasped in fright and leaped up on a table, assuming the inflatable alien position, her feather quivering where it curled into her face. Dex's alien guide ran into the living room as if the hounds were after him. Gini's heart was pounding as Dex reached out and opened the door. It wasn't a man in black. It was the Big Chill. Awkward. Merry Christmas, Virginia, Lincoln Graham said, his voice not as chilly as usual. He held a bag of gaily wrapped presents and a bottle of something that looked expensive, like he'd stepped out of an ad or a Christmas movie, one of the romance ones from Hallmark Channel. Everything about him was perfect, from his airbrushed hair to his casual winter boots. His cashmere coat fell perfectly open, and his jeans and t-shirt probably cost more than her car. Gini put a hand up, wondering if she'd remembered to brush her hair. She relocated her dropped jaw to its proper position. Merry Christmas. She should probably call him by his first name, but she never had. At least, she hadn't had a chance to get past Sir since the thing. She stepped back and almost tripped over Dex, who still had one hand on the door. Dex, this is Lincoln Graham, my, boss. Her voice was higher than usual, with a hint of shrill that might be panic or the fact that she wasn't her real age yet. And this is Dex, Dexter James Tolliver, our local sheriff. She swallowed. And family friend, of course. He's a friend, too. The Big Chill was no fool and never had been. Couldn't be one and get where he had in life. His gaze tracked from her to Dex, then back. At least it hadn't stopped at the alien on the entry table. There might have been some narrowing around the eyes, but he held out his hand. Dex did too, some sizing up, but neither gave away their conclusions about each other. No sign they did the whose grip is the strongest deal either. No reason they'd fight over her. She studied them again just to make sure. Nope. No sign of battle lines drawn. Not sure how she felt about that. She glanced back. 4 seemed to be the only alien in sight. Come in. Her smile and greeting felt stiff. We were just singing some Christmas carols and hoping for news of Gin's sister and husband getting here. We've been cut off, you know, Dex said, leading the way down the short hall to the great room. Gini didn't know if the aliens and Desi had beamed out or what. Only Isaac and Daphne were still in there. Daphne sat on the bench with her back to the piano, her eyes a bit wide. Did she have sense enough to fear the men in black? Maybe Isaac had filled her in. Daphne's gaze alighted on the Big Chill and went from anxious to interested. Then she gave Gini a what-the-what look and smoothed her hair down. Gini didn't blame her. The Big Chill might be light years older than Daphne, but he was definitely high-end. Isaac had sunk to the floor and was still writing in his notebook. In the sudden silence, he finally looked up. He took a long minute to study the Big Chill. The kid really was scary. Interesting that the Big Chill studied him back with equal something. And why was it easier to call him the Big Chill inside her head than Lincoln, or Link? His girlfriends called him Link, only she wasn't a girlfriend or his fiancée yet. Or ever. At least she wasn't greeting him as a 13-year-old. Small mercies. Though the mercies weren't quite 35 yet either. She held back a gasp when she caught sight of one of the aliens on the mantel. Until she got deeper into the room, the tree had hidden 3 or 4. She still couldn't tell which was which. The air was so thick with stuff, the Big Chill would have to be thick not to notice, and he wasn't thick. Daphne gave him the eye, mentally adding up the cost of his wardrobe. She shot Gini another incredulous look. The Big Chill noticed, and his lips twitched. He managed to look at ease, which was impressive, but not a surprise. The real question was, would he be able to keep his cool when the men in black arrived? A tiny choke escaped her compressed lips. Both men turned and looked at her. Dex's eyes held a warning. The Big Chill looked curious and alert. His gaze tracked up her, then down. A bit of puzzled appeared in the dark depths. How old was she right now? Or better yet, how tall was she right now? Was it a height thing or an age thing? The ball of heat formed in her stomach. Thankfully, he looked away before she surged closer to her real height. Not there yet, though. She unrolled one of the cuffs. 2 to go. Do you play? The Big Chill asked, indicating the piano. Daphne shook her head, so he looked at Gini. Only a little, very little. She lifted one hand, and even then. Gin's mom was playing, Dex broke in. I'm sure she'll be back. I am. Gini spun around and she was back, completely back. No, not quite. The fingers were bent again where she gripped the arms of her wheelchair, but she wasn't as bent as she'd been when Gini arrived. Her eyes were different too, more alert. Still, the contrast between the 8-year-old and the 80-year-old was startling. Even Daphne gave a small gasp. Desi looked more, Gini hesitated. Frail, almost transparent, as if she were fading from this life in front of their eyes. But the lines carved by pain were there, not as deep, but there. Gini resisted the impulse to reach out to her, to hold her here. Small Desi's words echoed in her head. They don't hurt anymore. Mom. She swallowed back the wrong words, at least wrong for the moment. This is Lincoln Graham, my boss. She made herself look at the big chill. This is my mother, Desi Prescott. Desi studied him carefully, even as she held out her hand. Was it Gini's imagination that the hand quivered, then became more bent? The big chill blinked and seemed to give himself a slight shake before he took her hand and murmured something polite. Neither of them seemed to know what to say after that. Finally, the big chill held out the bag of gifts. Gini jumped forward and accepted it. That's so sweet of you. She faltered to a stop. Dex took the bag and set it next to the tree. The silence that pooled around them was not a comfortable one. I think it's time to bake some Christmas cookies, her mom said, turning her wheelchair. Come, children. Dexter. Daphne's face resumed its more familiar discontent. Isaac glanced at the mantel, at the alien there, then followed Desi out of the room. Come on, Daphne. Dex took her arm when she seemed inclined to linger. Gini needs to talk to her, boss. He steered her out of the room. Gini wouldn't have thought it possible, but the silence got more uncomfortable. Finally, the big chill broke it. I did try to call. He studied her again, a faint crease forming between his perfectly marked brows. Standing next to him, she knew she wasn't the same height she'd been when she left Dallas. The difference wasn't huge, but she felt it. He was perceptive enough to know something was different. Gini gave him a wry, uncertain smile. No service up here, and our satellite has been covered in snow. She hesitated. I'm surprised you made it. I thought we were snowed in. I followed a snowplow in, and a bunch of official-looking vehicles. There's some kind of training exercise or something taking place further up the road, helicopters and everything. Training exercise? Almost Gini looked at 2 or 3. Training? She tried to keep her tone light. Wasn't sure she managed it. Yeah, that's what one of them said when he tried to stop me coming in. I'm surprised they let you, she said, her throat suddenly dry. The big chill arched his brows, and she was less surprised. They might be the men in black, but he was Lincoln Graham. I get the feeling you wish I hadn't. His tone was more statement than question, but there were question marks in his eyes. It's not. Gini managed to stop herself from saying you, which would give the wrong impression, or the right one. My mom, she's always interesting, and this year, well, she's pushed her own boundaries. Gini ran a hand through her hair and tried a smile that was probably a grimace. And the cop? For a minute, Gini didn't know what he was talking about. She blinked. Dex? Oh, right, I didn't know. He came up to Mom's sit until I got here. I was delayed, and then there was the blizzard. She stopped, trying to find her way back to his efficient PA. I had to wait for Biff's kids at the airport. He and Van got stuck at work, some kind of emergency. A NASA emergency? He sounded more amused than skeptical. Gini was kind of impressed he'd remembered her sister worked for NASA. She'd mentioned it maybe once. She felt some color in her cheeks, but managed to chuckle. Yeah, they are newlyweds, though. I am hoping they'll get here soon. Biff's kids aren't real happy with him right now. His gaze managed to pin her, snagging her gaze with ease and holding it. What's wrong? You mean besides my aging mother, the bitter stepkids, and... She stopped, but it didn't help. And the old boyfriend? We went to high school together. Why did she feel guilty? She'd arranged flower deliveries for his dates, and she hadn't said yes. Her mouth firmed, found a bit of her backbone. Why me? Her timing had been off pretty much from the beginning of this adventure in who knew what, so why change that now? To his credit, he didn't look away for about 15 seconds. His lips straightened. She recognized the look. Did he think she'd be a tough negotiation? I had a feeling you were getting ready to bolt. She blinked. And decided marriage was the solution? He shook his head. If it was only about your job, I'd have offered you more money. His head tilted a bit. But I have a feeling that wouldn't have taken it? Gini, a bit surprised at herself, shook her head. I liked working for you, but she hesitated, but decided author confessions were better than First Contact and the Men in Black. Been writing and thinking of moving back to, be closer to my mom. She's getting on, and there's just me and Van. And the boyfriend? I didn't know he'd moved back. Oops. That was an admission he had at least been one. He hesitated. She braced for more questions about Dex. He surprised her. Writing what? Novels. Science fiction. She took a breath. I'm afraid I'm a geek. I go to the cons and everything. Everything? I might have a Starfleet uniform. His lips twitched. That is something of a blow. He studied her as if trying to fit this new information into what he knew of his PA. You must write under a pen name? D.L. Prescott. He considered this. Why D.L.? When I was little, my parents used to say it was just dumb luck we survived. He laughed then. It warmed his whole face and might have made a flicker of something happen in her middle. A flicker she so did not have time for, she realized as 2 or 3 gave a tiny twitch. That's when she heard it, the sound of helicopters approaching. The big chill Lincoln, she mentally corrected herself, looked up, then his chin dropped and his gaze laser-focused on her. She'd seen that look before, too, though never directed at her until now. She gave him as innocent look as she could manage. How odd. I hope the exercise isn't going to run over us. Dateline. Notes from Isaac's Strategic Planning Notebook. I hope we are on right side. Too bad they aren't really Santa's elves. Dateline. From Daphne's cell phone. I think I need to forget, even if it lets Dad off the hook. Dateline. Advanced Scouting Party Report. And once again, First Contact goes horribly wrong. Dateline. Most secret, no one's eyes only. Finally, we have them.